Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves standing on a mist-shrouded hill, the air thick with the coppery tang of blood and the cries of the dying. It's late afternoon, October 14th, 1066, but this isn't the Senlac Hill you read about in the textbooks, because tonight the arrow or the axe or whatever it was found a different mark. William the Bastard lies fallen, his Norman dream shattered, and King Harold Godwinson, though grievously wounded, still breathes. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief from the Anglo-Saxon shield wall, or what's left of it. But don't get too comfortable in this alternate England. Survival in these brutal medieval times, even for a victorious king, is a knife-edge affair. And you probably won't survive this if you are a Norman knight expecting a quick victory. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The last rays of a blood-orange sun are slicing through the carnage, painting long, eerie shadows across the churned mud and broken bodies. You're there, not as a combatant, thankfully, but as a silent observer, watching King Harold Godwinson. He's propped against the tattered remnants of his royal standard, the fighting man, which, unlike him, didn't quite make it through the day in one piece. One eye is a swollen, bloody mess. Perhaps the infamous arrow found its way near, but not into his brain. His left arm hangs limp, bound in a crude, stained dressing, and every breath seems to rattle in his chest. But he's alive, and on this field that's everything. Around you, the din of battle has faded, replaced by a symphony of suffering. The moans of wounded Englishmen, the despairing cries of captured Normans, the guttural shouts of housecarls as they methodically, grimly dispatch any enemy still showing signs of fight. The air is a noxious brew of sweat, iron, churned earth, and something else. Something sweet and cloying that speaks of too much life spilled too quickly. It's a smell that clings to the back of your throat, a stark reminder that victory has a butcher's bill. And Harold, your king, for barely 9 tumultuous months, is staring at that bill with an expression that's hard to read. Relief? Yes, but also a profound, bone-deep weariness. His gaze sweeps across the slope of Coldbeck Hill, what the Normans, in their brief, arrogant moment, might have called Senlac. Now, it's just a charnel house. He can see the spot where his brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, fell. In this timeline, maybe Gurth, always the more cautious, who'd begged Harold not to lead the army himself, took a spear meant for the king earlier in the day. Leofwine, younger, firier, perhaps met his end charging a particularly stubborn knot of Norman knights. Harold had seen them fall, moments of sickening clarity in the swirling chaos. Their loss is a fresh, raw wound, as painful as any physical injury he bears. He'd ignored Gurth's plea, made before the battle to let him lead, as Harold had sworn an oath to William. An oath taken under duress, everyone knew, but an oath nonetheless. Gurth had argued that he, having sworn no such thing, could fight William with a clearer conscience. Harold, stubborn as ever, had insisted on leading his men. Now, 2 brothers are gone. A heavy price for a crown he never truly sought. The shield wall, that magnificent, bristling barricade of English defiance, is broken in places, but fundamentally, miraculously, it held. For 9 long hours it had stood firm. Historians still argue whether William's feigned retreats in our timeline were a pre-planned brilliant tactic, or desperate improvisations that luckily worked out. Here today, they were mostly desperate. A couple of times, parts of the Fyrd, the less experienced militia, had surged forward, eager to chase the seemingly fleeing Normans, just like in our history. But Harold, or his housecarls, had managed to rally them, to plug the gaps, to bellow them back into formation. It was like trying to keep a particularly enthusiastic but poorly trained sheepdog from scattering the flock at the sight of a squirrel. This time, crucially, the discipline, the sheer bloody-mindedness of the Anglo-Saxons had just about outlasted Norman aggression. The turning point, as Harold would later piece together from breathless accounts, came late in the afternoon. William, ever the frontline commander, was personally leading another charge, trying to punch through near Harold's standard. He was a whirlwind of fury, his mace a blur. But the ground was slick with gore, his horse stumbled, and for a fatal second he was exposed. An unnamed thegn, perhaps from a small village in Sussex, whose grandchildren would never know his name, but would live in a profoundly different England, seized his chance. A lucky spear thrust, or a desperate swing of a Dane axe, the details are already becoming legend. And the Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror that wasn't, was down. Not just down, but decisively so. The cry went up, first hesitant, then a roar. The bastard is slain. Panic, true and irreversible, finally shattered the Norman lines. Their cavalry, already battered, wheeled and fled. Their infantry, seeing their duke fall, lost all cohesion. It became less a battle and more a rout, a savage pursuit down the hill and into the woods beyond. Harold, despite his wounds, had tried to rise, to order a more controlled pursuit, but his legs wouldn't obey. He could only watch, his vision blurring, as his men, fueled by adrenaline and the primal fury of a nation fighting for its very existence, exacted their terrible revenge. Now, as dusk deepens and the first stars prick the bruised sky, a housecarl approaches Harold, his face grimed with sweat and blood, but his eyes alight. "My king," he says, his voice hoarse. "The Norman Duke is confirmed dead. We have his banner." He holds up the papal banner, the one given to William to sanctify his invasion. Harold just nods, a flicker of grim satisfaction in his one good eye. That banner had been a sore point, a symbol of external meddling. He might need more than a simple bandage for his own wounds. But William, well, William wouldn't be needing any medical attention at all. The immediate survival of England, or at least Anglo-Saxon England, is secured. The invaders are broken, their leader dead. There will be no harrowing of the north, no Domesday Book, no Norman castles dominating the skyline. Or at least not those versions. But Harold knows this is just the end of a chapter, not the end of the story. Other Normans remain. Other challengers will rise. The cost of this victory, strewn across this bloody hill, is immense. The flower of English nobility lies alongside the common Fyrdman. Rebuilding will take time, and his own strength is ebbing. He needs to get to London. He needs to consolidate. He needs a healer, and perhaps a stiff drink. Though probably not in that order if he's honest. The post-battle snacks, he imagines, will be rather grim tonight. The journey from the slaughter stench of Caldbeck Hill to London is a grim, jolting affair, made infinitely worse by your king's festering wounds. You, as his ever-present silent companion, watch Harold Godwinson grapple not just with physical agony, but with the urgent, crushing weight of his newly resecured kingdom. He's carried on a litter, the smoothest ride his frantic household can improvise, but every bump sends a fresh wave of fire through his injured iron arm. Sleep offers little respite, filled with flashing images of battle, the faces of his dead brothers, and the terrifying abyss that England had so narrowly avoided. He probably wishes he'd invested in some of that crocodile dung sunscreen his ancestors might have heard about from Roman traders. Not for the sun, but for the sheer unrelenting awfulness of the journey. News of the victory at Hastings, or rather, the Battle of Saint-Lache, as it might be known in this timeline, using the older English name for the area, has preceded him, carried by swift riders. It's a ripple that becomes a wave, then a tsunami of rumour, disbelief, and finally exultation across the southeast. When his weary party finally approaches London, the mood is electric. The citizens, who had been bracing for a Norman siege, spill out of the city gates. They cheer, they weep, they throw flowers, or possibly just old vegetables, it's hard to tell in the crush, at his litter. It's a hero's welcome, but Harold, peering through the narrow slit of his bandages, knows the fragility of it all. One battle, however decisive, doesn't make a secure reign. His first priority, even before his wounds are properly tended by the city's best, and hopefully soberest, physicians, is to deal with any lingering pro-Norman sentiment within London itself. There were always merchants, nobles, even churchmen who had seen potential advantage in William's claim. It's an established historical fact that London initially offered to submit to William after the defeat at Hastings in our timeline, though not without some deliberation. Here, that deliberation is cut short. Harold, propped up in his bedchamber in the old Roman palace, summons the Witan, or at least those members who are readily available in London. His voice is weak, raspy, but his orders are clear. Any known collaborators, anyone who even whispered of welcoming the Normans, are to be rounded up. There are no mass executions. Harold isn't naturally cruel, and he needs to unite, not terrify, his kingdom. But key figures find themselves suddenly under house arrest, their lands and assets temporarily seized. A clear message is sent. England is for the English, and Harold Godwinson is its undisputed king. Well, mostly undisputed. Edwin and Morcar, the powerful earls of Mercia and Northumbria, had arrived with their levies too late for the battle itself. They had met Harold's retreating army after Stamford Bridge, and had, rather reluctantly, agreed to follow himself. They hadn't exactly covered themselves in glory, and their forces were still largely intact. They arrive in London a few days after Harold, their expressions a careful mixture of relief for the kingdom, and perhaps a touch of something less charitable for Harold's personal success. Harold, despite his injuries, meets them. He needs them. Their northern power base is crucial. He confirms their earldoms, praises their loyalty, a loyalty he privately questions but publicly lauds, and subtly reminds them that a united England is a strong England. He might even offer a choice bit of confiscated Norman loot as a sweetener, perhaps a particularly fancy helmet that William won't be needing anymore. The medieval equivalent of a very shiny, very pointy consolation prize. The next few weeks are a blur of pain, politics and poultices. Harold's eye remains a major concern. The royal physicians, with their potions of herbs, boar's grease and whispered charms, do their best. One particularly eccentric monk suggests a poultice involving pigeon droppings and powdered earthworm. a remedy Harold politely declines. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? This makes it sound positively appealing. Eventually it becomes clear that the sight in that eye is lost forever. He will be a one-eyed king, like a figure from the Norse sagas he so admired. It adds to his mystique a visible scar of his sacrifice for England. With the immediate threat of Norman sympathisers neutralised in London, Harold turns his attention to rewarding those who fought and bled with him. Land is the currency of power. The estates of Norman nobles who came with William, expecting to carve out new lordships, are now forfeit. These are distributed with calculated generosity. His loyal housecarls receive prime manors. Thanes who distinguished themselves get additions to their holdings. He even ensures that the families of those who fell, like his brothers Gurth and Leofwine, are provided for, their lands passing to legitimate heirs or being held in trust. This redistribution is vital. It binds men to him with ties of gratitude and self-interest. It also begins to subtly shift the power balance, rewarding the martial class that had saved the kingdom. Of course, not everyone is happy. Some think they deserve more. Others grumble that old scores aren't being settled quickly enough. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Stigand, is a particular headache. He'd been excommunicated by one pope, and his appointment was considered irregular by another. His presence had been one of William's justifications for invasion. Harold knows Stigand's position is untenable in the long run if he wants peaceful relations with Rome, but Stigand had crowned him. For now, Harold offers him public support, a necessary evil until the kingdom is more stable. Scholars still debate the precise long-term impact of Stigand's controversial tenure on the English Church, even in our own timeline, where he was swiftly deposed after the conquest. In this new reality, his fate is tied to Harold's ability to navigate treacherous ecclesiastical waters. There's also the small matter of William's body. It was recovered from the battlefield, stripped bare by ghouls like any common soldier. Harold, in a gesture that might be seen as either magnanimous or a calculated insult, has it quietly returned to Normandy. No grand ransom, no public display, just a stark message: your duke is dead, his ambitions buried with him. Take him home. It's a power move, delivered from a bed of pain, but a power move nonetheless. He's trying to close the chapter, but he knows, with a weary certainty, that the Normans aren't the type to just shrug and say, "Oh, well, better luck next time." The south coast, he senses, will not remain peaceful for long. He needs ships, he needs coastal defences, and he needs to get back on his feet. England has been saved, but the cost of that salvation is only just beginning to be tallied, and the bill, as always, will be paid in blood and treasure. Harold, one eye glaring at the future, prepares to pay it. The taste of victory, though sweet, quickly sours with the salt spray of renewed Norman aggression. You feel the tension return to Harold's court, now bustling with a grim purpose, even as the king himself is still recovering. His one good eye is constantly scanning maps of the south coast, his mind racing. He knew William's death wouldn't be the end of it. The Duchy of Normandy is a hornet's nest of ambitious, land-hungry knights and powerful barons. And William, for all his faults, was a strong leader who kept them somewhat in check, often by pointing them at external targets. Now, with him gone, and the English adventure having ended in such a catastrophic, humiliating failure, the desire for revenge, burns fiercely across the Channel. It doesn't take long. Within months of Hastings, perhaps by the spring of 1067, the first reports of Norman raids trickle in. Not a full-scale invasion. They lack a unifying leader of William's stature, and frankly, the stomach for another pitched battle against the infamous Saxon shield wall. Instead, these are hit-and-run attacks, classic Viking-style coastal harassment, which the Normans, being of Viking descent themselves, Rollo's merry men weren't exactly known for their polite tea parties, are exceptionally good at. Small fleets of longships, crewed by knights who perhaps missed William's initial expedition, or younger sons eager to prove their mettle and win plunder, target vulnerable towns and villages along the Sussex and Kent coasts. They burn fishing boats, sack isolated monasteries for their meagre treasures, and carry off livestock and the occasional unfortunate captive for ransom. Harold, still not fully mobile, but fuming with impatience, directs the response from London. He dispatches his most trusted housecarls and thanes to organise the coastal defences. The third system, the Anglo-Saxon levy of common soldiers, which had fought so valiantly at Hastings, is called upon again. Watchtowers are manned, and local militias drill on village greens, their pitchforks and hunting spears, looking rather inadequate against mailed Norman raiders. It's a frustrating, piecemeal war. The Normans strike like lightning and vanish before a significant force can be brought against them. It's an established historical fact that the south coast of England was frequently raided by Vikings and others for centuries before 1066. So this kind of threat was nothing new, though the Norman flavour of it was. The psychological impact on the coastal communities is severe. They had celebrated Harold's victory, believing the Norman threat extinguished. Now, every unfamiliar sail on the horizon brings fresh terror. Trade is disrupted. Fishermen are afraid to venture out. Some villagers, remembering the brutal efficiency of the raiders, begin to mutter that perhaps a strong Norman king wouldn't have been so bad if he could guarantee peace. A dangerous sentiment that Harold's spies are quick to report. One quirky, though grim, imagined detail of this period might be the sudden proliferation of sea monster sightings. Fearful peasants, their nerves frayed, might easily mistake a Norman longship appearing suddenly out of the mist for some new terror from the deep, especially if their priest has been preaching particularly vivid sermons about God's wrath. It's amazing what a bit of collective anxiety can do to one's perception of a simple wooden boat. Harold understands he cannot simply play whack-a-mole with these raiders. He needs a more proactive strategy. He orders the refurbishment and expansion of the English fleet. In our timeline, Harold did have a fleet in 1066, a significant one, but he'd been forced to disband it in early September due to dwindling supplies and the harvest, a decision that left the southern coast tragically exposed when William finally sailed. Now, with the immediate crisis of invasion past, he pours resources into shipbuilding. The shipwrights of London, Dover, and other port towns are kept busy. He needs faster ships, more of them, capable of intercepting the Norman raiding parties before they can make landfall. He also begins to establish a more permanent system of coastal patrols, learning from the mistakes of the past. This renewed focus on naval power is a significant, if costly, development. Think of it as an early, desperate attempt at a Saxon shore fortification system, but against descendants of Vikings rather than Saxons themselves. The raids also create a political problem. Some of the English nobility, particularly those with lands far from the south coast, grumble about the expense of these defensive measures. Why should Mercian silver pay for Kentish woes? Is a sentiment Harold has to counter. He argues, forcefully, that an attack on any part of England is an attack on all of it. This is a constant theme of his reign: unity in the face of external threats. Some scholars debate the precise level of unity within pre-conquest England, with arguments ranging from a relatively cohesive kingdom to a fragile collection of powerful, often competing earldoms. Harold, in this timeline, is forced to actively forge that unity through constant vigilance and shared struggle. The Norman threat isn't just from independent adventurers either. William had a legitimate son, Robert Curthose, and brothers like Odo of Bayeux, who in our timeline commissioned the Bayeux Tapestry and became a very wealthy Earl of Kent. While they might be squabbling over William's continental possessions, the idea of avenging their kinsman and reclaiming the lost English crown won't be far from their minds. Harold anticipates this. He strengthens garrisons in key southern towns like Dover and Pevensey, the very places William had used. He ensures these strongpoints are well supplied and commanded by men of proven loyalty. He cannot afford another landing in force. The constant low-level warfare takes its toll on Harold personally. His health, never fully recovered from Hastings, suffers under the strain. The missing eye aches in damp weather. The old wounds twinge, but he remains resolute. He even makes a few appearances on the coast himself, his presence a morale booster for the defenders. He's seen inspecting fortifications, speaking with local feared leaders, his one eye blazing with determination. He becomes a symbol of English resistance, a warrior king still, even if his fighting days are largely behind him. The raids are a bitter reminder that victory is not a destination, but a continuous struggle. And as summer approaches, bringing with it calmer seas ideal for raiding, Harold knows the Normans will be back. He can only hope his preparations are enough. The south coast has become a new front line, a bleeding wound that refuses to heal, constantly reminding England of the price of its freedom. While your southern shores are being nipped at by Norman sea wolves, a different kind of storm is brewing in the north. Harold Godwinson, a king now perpetually juggling crises, must turn his one good eye towards the often turbulent lands beyond the Humber. Remember Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria? Their loyalty, always a rather elastic concept, is about to be tested again. They had shown up late for Hastings, their armies largely intact, and while Harold had publicly praised them and confirmed their lands, a seed of mistrust lingered. Now, with Harold bogged down dealing with Norman coastal raids and still physically weakened, they might see an opportunity. It's the medieval equivalent of your colleagues noticing you're overwhelmed with a big project and starting to subtly undermine you in meetings. The north of England had always been a bit of a world unto itself, with strong Scandinavian influences and a history of resisting southern kings. It's an established historical fact that rebellions in the north were a recurring problem for Anglo-Saxon, and, later, Norman kings. Harold himself had marched north earlier in 1066 to defeat Harold Hardrada and his own treacherous brother Tostig at Stamford Bridge. That victory had been costly, weakening his army just before Hastings. Now, the chickens of northern discontent are coming home to roost, perhaps with a Scottish rooster leading the flock. King Malcolm III of Scotland, also known as Malcolm Canmore, is an opportunistic and aggressive neighbour. In our timeline, he married Margaret, an Anglo-Saxon princess of the old Wessex line, and frequently raided northern England, ostensibly to support her claim or that of her brother Edgar Atheling. In this new reality, with Harold on the throne, Malcolm's motives are likely much the same: expand Scottish influence and territory, and generally stir the pot. He might see Harold's preoccupation with the Normans as an invitation. Perhaps Edgar Atheling, the young and rather ineffective claimant to the English throne, whom the Witan had initially chosen after Edward the Confessor's death before plumping for Harold, has fled to Scotland. He'd be a convenient puppet for Malcolm, so you can imagine Harold, already sleep-deprived and irritable from the Norman situation, receiving messengers with increasingly grim news from the north. Scottish raiding parties crossing the Tweed, burning villages in Northumbria. Whispers that Earl Morcar, and perhaps even his brother Edwin in Mercia, are not acting with sufficient vigour to repel them. Are they simply incompetent? Or are they tacitly allowing the chaos, hoping to strengthen their own positions, perhaps even contemplating an alliance with Malcolm against Harold? Historians still argue whether the Northern Earl's actions into 66 and subsequent years in our timeline were driven more by self-preservation, regional ambition, or a genuine desire for a different English kingship. That debate is alive and well in Harold's mind too. One quirky tidbit from this period could be the resurgence of local Northumbrian saints or folk heroes whose legends involve repelling Scottish raiders. In times of uncertainty, people often turn to the supernatural or the legendary for comfort and inspiration. Perhaps old stories of warrior hermits who single-handedly held bridges against invaders are dusted off and retold with renewed fervour around village fires, a subtle form of passive resistance, and a call for stronger local leadership if the earls aren't providing it. These tales, full of exaggerated heroism, might even feature a particularly grumpy badger who helps trip up the Scots. Stranger things have happened in folklore. Harold knows he can't afford a full-blown Northern rebellion or a Scottish war while the Norman threat simmers. He needs to act decisively, but also carefully. A direct confrontation with Edwin and Morcar could split the kingdom. Instead, he employs a combination of diplomacy and veiled threats. He summoned them to a council, perhaps in a neutral location like Lincoln or York. Cities with enough royal presence to make them think twice about outright defiance. He reminds them of their oaths of loyalty, of the shared danger England faces. He might offer them further incentives, perhaps more autonomy in their earldoms, or a greater share of any recovered lands from Scottish incursions, provided they effectively secure the border. He plays the good cop, but the bad cop, the threat of royal displeasure, and the still formidable reputation of his housecarls, is implicitly present. Simultaneously, he sends envoys to Malcolm of Scotland. These aren't begging letters, but firm communications outlining the consequences of continued aggression. Harold might even subtly hint at supporting rival claimants to the Scottish throne, if Malcolm doesn't back down. A bit of medieval realpolitik. He could also offer a renewal of old treaties, perhaps even a dynastic marriage alliance, once his own succession is more secure, and his children are older. Anything to buy peace on the northern frontier. He's like a homeowner trying to negotiate with a noisy neighbour, while simultaneously dealing with a persistent termite infestation in the basement. The situation with Edwin and Morcar is particularly delicate. They command significant military power. If they were to ally with Malcolm, and perhaps even with any remaining pockets of pro-Norman sentiment, Harold would face a multi-front war that could prove fatal. He has to flatter their egos while reasserting his authority. He might praise their lineage, their past services, however meagre, and appeal to their patriotism. But beneath the velvet glove, there's an iron fist. He discreetly reinforces royal garrisons in key northern towns and ensures that the sheriffs in areas bordering their earldoms are men fiercely loyal to him. The outcome of this northern reckoning is crucial. If Harold can pacify the region through a combination of diplomacy, veiled force, and perhaps a little bit of luck, maybe Malcolm gets distracted by a particularly enticing raid into Strathclyde instead, then he can consolidate his power. If not, England risks sliding back into the kind of internal strife that so often weakened it in the past. Harold, scarred and weary but unbowed, is fighting not just for his crown, but for the very concept of a unified English kingdom. The ghosts of Stamford Bridge linger, a reminder of northern treachery and the price of vigilance. He cannot afford to make the same mistake twice, letting a northern threat fester until it becomes a full-blown crisis. The wind blowing from the north carries the scent of snow and trouble, and Harold braces himself for its chill. With the southern coast simmering and the northern border hopefully stabilised, for now at least, you know how restless those northern earls can be, Harold turns his attention to a more insidious internal issue, the state of the English Church, and specifically the festering problem of Archbishop Stigand. You're now in the King's council chambers in London, the air thick with the scent of beeswax candles and the low murmur of concerned advisers. Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is the elephant in the room, or rather, the excommunicated Archbishop whose continued presence is causing Harold a royal headache. Stigand was a political survivor, a man who had managed to hold onto his position through multiple reigns. However, his appointment as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1052 was highly controversial. The previous Norman Archbishop, Robert of Jumièges, had been driven out, and Stigand, already Bishop of Winchester, simply added Canterbury to his portfolio. This was a big no-no in the eyes of Rome. Pluralism, holding multiple church offices, was frowned upon, and the whole affair was seen as uncanonical. Pope Leo IX and his successors refused to recognise Stigand, and he was eventually excommunicated. It's an established historical fact that Stigand's irregular position was one of the key justifications William the Conqueror used for his invasion, painting it as a holy crusade to reform the corrupt English Church. William even carried a papal banner at Hastings, remember? The one Harold grimly had returned with the Duke's body. Now, Harold has won. The Normans are gone, for the most part, but the Stigand problem remains. Harold needs the Church. He needs its administrative network, its educated clerks, its spiritual authority to legitimise his rule. But he also needs good relations with the papacy, especially if he wants to avoid further holy invasions blessed by Rome. Having an excommunicated Archbishop of Canterbury is like having a giant "kick me" sign on England's back, visible all the way to the Vatican. It undermines Harold's legitimacy on the international stage and provides a ready-made excuse for any continental ruler with an eye on the English throne. Harold is in a bind. Stigand had crowned him king. Deposing him too quickly could look like ingratitude, or worse, weakness. Caving to papal pressure that he had ostensibly just fought a war to resist. In part. Stigand also has his own network of supporters within the English clergy, men who benefited from his patronage. A clumsy removal could provoke internal dissent within the church itself. It's a delicate operation, like trying to remove a splinter from a very large, very grumpy bear. So, Harold plays it smart. He doesn't immediately depose Stigand. Instead, he begins a campaign of subtle pressure and careful negotiation. He sends envoys to Rome, not grovelling, but explaining the situation in England, emphasising his own piety, which was genuine. Harold was known for his religious devotion, and had even gone on pilgrimage to Rome in his youth, and his desire for a normalised relationship. He might argue that Stigand's continued temporary presence was necessary for stability in the immediate aftermath of the invasion attempt, but that he is committed to reforming the English Church in line with canonical law. Scholars still debate the extent to which the pre-conquest English Church was truly in need of reform, or if this was largely Norman propaganda. Harold would likely argue for the former, while subtly implying the latter. Meanwhile, back in England, Harold starts to elevate other, more papally acceptable churchmen. He consults more frequently with bishops, known for their reformist views and good standing with Rome, like Wulfstan of Worcester, a genuinely saintly figure. He might subtly divert patronage and resources away from Stigand's faction and towards these more orthodox clerics. He needs to build an alternative power base within the church before he can safely remove its problematic head. A quirky fringe tidbit here might involve the ordeal by cake. While trial by ordeal, like holding a hot iron, was a known, if rather brutal, part of the justice system, there's a less famous, almost comical story associated with Harold's father, Earl Godwin. Accused of involvement in the murder of Alfred Etheling, King Edward the Confessor's brother, years before, Godwin supposedly choked to death on a piece of bread at a royal banquet after swearing an oath of innocence, a divine judgment. Perhaps, in a moment of black humour, someone at Harold's court suggests a trial by consecrated wafer for Stigand. If he chokes, problem solved. Harold, of course, would dismiss such a silly and blasphemous idea, but the stress of the situation probably makes even the darkest jokes seem momentarily appealing. The process is slow. Stigand, wily old politician that he is, doesn't go quietly. He uses his influence, pulls his strings, but Harold is patient. He waits for the right moment. Perhaps Stigand makes a political misstep, or perhaps Harold's envoys in Rome secure a promise of swift recognition for a new, properly appointed archbishop if Stigand is removed. Eventually, perhaps a year or two after Hastings, Harold convenes a great church council. With carefully laid groundwork, Stigand is persuaded, or compelled, to retire for the good of the kingdom and the church. He's allowed to keep some of his personal wealth, perhaps his see of Winchester for a time, to avoid making him a martyr. It's a managed exit, not a brutal purge. His replacement is crucial. Harold needs someone loyal, pious, respected, and acceptable to Rome. Perhaps he elevates Wulfstan of Worcester, though Wulfstan might be reluctant to leave his beloved diocese. Or maybe he finds another prominent English cleric, someone like Ildred, Archbishop of York, who had also crowned Harold, and was in better standing with Rome, though he died in 1069 in our timeline. Here, his lifespan might be different. The choice would signal the future direction of the Saxon Church, English-led, reformed from within, but seeking reconciliation with the wider Christian world. This reshaping of the English church has profound long-term consequences. Without the massive influx of Norman bishops and abbots who followed William, the English church retains more of its native character, its vernacular traditions, like preaching in English, and its distinct saints and customs. The relationship with Rome is re-established, but perhaps on slightly more assertive terms than if a conquered England had been brought to heel by a papally backed Norman regime. Harold, the warrior king, also becomes Harold the Reformer, carefully guiding his kingdom's spiritual life back into the European mainstream, but on his own terms. The shadow of Stigund's pallium, that symbol of archiepiscopal authority he had received irregularly from an anti-pope, finally lifts from England. With the crown secured, the Normans mostly at bay, the north grumbling but not in open revolt, and the church slowly being nudged back into line with Rome, you can now turn your attention to something less immediately life or death, but profoundly impactful in the long run: the English language itself. Imagine yourself in a smoky scriptorium, perhaps at a monastery in Winchester, the old capital. Monks are painstakingly copying manuscripts, not just in Latin, the universal language of the church and scholarship, but in vibrant Old English. This is a scene that, in our timeline, would soon change dramatically. The Norman Conquest of 1066, as you know, had a cataclysmic effect on the English language. For centuries, Norman French became a language of power, of law, of administration, of literature. English was relegated to the peasantry, the common folk. It survived, of course, resilient and stubborn, but it was profoundly altered, absorbing thousands of French words, its grammar simplifying. The rich Germanic tapestry of Old English became Middle English, a hybrid tongue. But here, in Harold's England, that linguistic earthquake never happens. The English language is set on a different developmental path. Harold Godwinson, though a sophisticated and multilingual ruler, he likely spoke some Norse and perhaps a little French, given his continental dealings, was a patron of English culture. His court, his administration, his legal pronouncements, all would continue to operate primarily in English. There's no sudden influx of French-speaking nobles demanding their charters be written in their tongue. There's no linguistic snobbery dictating that French is the language of polite society. English remains the language of the ruling class, as well as the commoners. So, what does this mean for the language you and I are, metaphorically, speaking right now? Well, for starters, it would sound very different. Old English, the language of Beowulf, is a heavily inflected language, like German or Latin, with complex noun declensions and verb conjugations. While all languages change and simplify over time, the relentless pressure of French after 1066 accelerated this simplification in English. Without that pressure, English might retain more of its grammatical complexity for longer. You might still be declining your nouns for case: the king, the kinges, to the kinge, the kinge, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, much later into the medieval period. It would make learning English grammar a whole different ballgame for future students, probably involving more tears and frustration. You thought irregular verbs were bad. Try irregular noun endings for everything. The vocabulary would also be strikingly different. Think of all the words in modern English that come from French: justice, parliament, army, castle, royal, beauty, pork, beef. In Harold's England, Germanic equivalents would likely persist or evolve. Instead of justice, you might have right or dom. Instead of parliament, the White Najamot or Witan, the Council of Wise Men, would continue, and its name would be the natural term for a legislative assembly. Army might be here, or fyrd. Castle might remain burh, or festen. You wouldn't eat beef, from the French boeuf, or pork. You'd eat couflesh, cow flesh, and swinflesh, swine flesh, much like German Rindfleisch and Schweinefleisch. This isn't to say English wouldn't borrow words. It always has, from Celtic, Latin, and Norse. But the massive, overwhelming influx from French wouldn't occur. The language would feel and sound much more Germanic. Perhaps a bit like modern Frisian, or a heavily Norse-influenced dialect of German. It's an established historical fact that even before the conquest, Old English possessed a rich and sophisticated literary tradition with epic poems, religious verse, and prose chronicles. The Peterborough Chronicle, for instance, continued in English for a while, even after the Normans arrived. In Harold's England, this literary tradition would flourish uninterrupted. Monasteries would continue to copy and compose in the vernacular. Court poets, instead of trying to ape French chansons de geste, would further develop the alliterative verse forms of Old English. Imagine epic sagas celebrating Harold's victory at Hastings, or lyrical poems about the beauty of the English countryside, all penned in a language much closer to Beowulf than to Chaucer. Chaucer himself, if he ever existed in this timeline, would be writing in a vastly different linguistic landscape. A quirky, imagined detail of this linguistic continuity might be the persistence of certain Old English letters in everyday writing. The thorn, tu18, and f, d, both representing the sounds, might remain common, rather than being replaced by fiend. You might also see the ash a and win w more frequently. Your keyboard would need a few extra keys. Imagine trying to type an email with all those extra characters. Autocorrect would have a complete meltdown. Some scholars debate how much a standard Old English truly existed, given regional dialectal variations, but the West Saxon dialect, patronised by King Alfred the Great and used in many official documents and literary works, had achieved a degree of prominence. This West Saxon standard, or something evolved from it, would likely continue as the prestige dialect under Harold, who hailed from Wessex. This could mean that other regional dialects might have less influence on the standard written language than they did in our timeline, where the chaos following the conquest eventually led to the rise of the London dialect, a Mercian dialect, as the basis for modern Standard English. The implications extend beyond just the sound and vocabulary. Language shapes thought. A language less influenced by French legal and administrative terms might lead to subtly different ways of conceptualizing law and governance. The English literary imagination, drawing on different roots, might produce different kinds of stories, different national myths. The very feel of being English would be different, rooted in an unbroken linguistic and cultural heritage, stretching back to the earliest Anglo-Saxon settlements. This England speaks with a voice that is older, perhaps gruffer, more overtly Germanic, but undeniably its own. It's a voice that never had to whisper in the shadows, while foreign conquerors dictated the terms of its expression. The bards are singing in the mead halls, and they are singing in English. An English William the Conqueror would barely have understood, and certainly wouldn't have approved of. The echoes of battle have faded, the ink on new charters is drying, and the language of the land continues its ancient course. But now, Harold Godwinson, King of the English, faces a challenge as old as a monarchy itself: succession. You're in the royal chambers again. Perhaps a few years have passed. Harold is older, the lines of care etched deeper around his remaining eye. The weight of the crown is not just in the gold and jewels, but in the gnawing anxiety for the future. How does he ensure that his hard-won peace, his Godwinson dynasty, outlives him? It's a medieval Game of Thrones, and the stakes are nothing less than the stability of England. Harold had children from his first Danish or common law marriage to Edith Swanwick, Aegith Swanhnes, Edith the Gentle Swan, or Swan Neck. These included sons like Godwin, Edmund, and Magnus. In our timeline, after Harold's death, they attempted some ill-fated rebellions from Ireland, but ultimately faded into obscurity. Here, they are very much in the picture. They are young men now, perhaps given minor earldoms or commands in the army, learning the ropes of governance and warfare. Harold would undoubtedly be grooming them, trying to determine which among them possesses the strength, wisdom, and crucially the support to hold the kingdom together. Then there's his queen, Ealdgyth, sister of Earls Edwin and Morcar, and widow of the Welsh king Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, whom Harold himself had defeated. Harold married her in 1066, a political alliance to secure the support of her powerful brothers. By now, she may have borne him a son, perhaps named Harold like his father, or Edward, after the Confessor, to lend a touch of traditional legitimacy. This child, born in the purple, i.e., while Harold was king, might be seen by some as having a stronger claim than his older half-brothers from the less formal union with Edith Swanwick. It's an established historical fact that questions of legitimacy surrounding children from different types of unions were a frequent source of succession crises in the medieval period. Think of William the Conqueror himself, William the Bastard, whose illegitimate birth was a constant point of contention. So, Harold has a complex family situation. His sons by Edith Swanwick are older, more experienced, and likely have their own factions of supporters, men who fought alongside them or their father. But a son by Queen Ealdgyth, with her powerful Mercian and Northumbrian connections, could represent a union of the old Wessex dynasty, through Harold, and the northern power bloc. This could be a powerful unifying force, or a source of bitter rivalry between the half-brothers. Harold, ever the pragmatist, would be weighing these factors carefully. He knows that a disputed succession is an open invitation for internal chaos and foreign opportunism. The Normans across the Channel, still smarting, would be watching for any sign of weakness. He might try to secure the succession by having the Witan formally acknowledge his chosen heir. The Witenagemot, the great council of nobles and clergy, traditionally had a role in acclaiming a new king. Harold could convene a special Witan, present his preferred son, perhaps the eldest and most capable of the Swanwick sons, or the young prince by Ealdgyth if he shows promise and has strong backing, and have the assembled magnates swear oaths of fealty to him. This wouldn't be an absolute guarantee. Oaths could be broken, as Harold himself knew all too well from his own alleged oath to William, but it would be a significant step. It's like trying to pre-approve your successor with the board of directors, hoping they'll stick to the plan when you're gone. The personalities of the potential heirs would be crucial. Is Godwin, the eldest Swanwick son, a strong warrior, but perhaps too rash? Is Edmund more thoughtful but lacking his father's charisma? Is young Harold, the Queen's son, still too much of a child, easily manipulated by his ambitious uncles, Edwin and Morcar, Harold would be observing them, testing them, perhaps sending them on difficult assignments to gauge their abilities. He might even consider, in a truly radical move for the time, dividing some responsibilities, though a divided kingdom was usually a recipe for disaster. Some scholars debate whether Anglo-Saxon kingship was strictly hereditary, or if the Witan had a more genuinely elective role, choosing the most suitable candidate from the royal kin. Harold's actions here would likely try to blend both, designating an heir but seeking the Witan's crucial endorsement. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to succession could be the increased importance of royal genealogies and prophetic pronouncements. In an age where legitimacy was paramount, court historians, or more likely monks with a flair for creative writing, might be subtly enhancing the Godwinson lineage, perhaps discovering convenient ancestral links to earlier revered kings. Prophecies, perhaps attributed to some obscure saint or a reinterpretation of Merlin's ramblings, though Merlin was more of a Welsh thing, his fame could spread, might predict a long and glorious future for Harold's line. Remember the emphasis on Edward the Confessor's piety. Harold might commission a glowing Life of King Harold, emphasising his own divine favour, evidenced by the victory at Hastings. It's all part of the medieval PR campaign to make the dynasty look inevitable and divinely sanctioned. The rival claimants, though diminished, are still out there. Edgar Etheling, the last male descendant of the old Wessex royal line, might still be alive, perhaps in Scotland or even on the continent. While he had proven ineffective in our timeline, in a moment of crisis, he could become a rallying point for malcontents. Harold needs to ensure his own sons are seen as the natural and rightful successors, not just by force of arms, but by perceived legitimacy and competence. Harold might also try to secure his dynasty through strategic marriages for his other children, including his daughters, like Gunhild or Gaitha. Marrying them to powerful English nobles could create a web of alliances, binding the aristocracy to his family. He might even look abroad, perhaps to Denmark or Norway, to forge alliances against the Norman threat, offering a daughter's hand in return for naval support or a non-aggression pact. These are chess moves on a grand scale, with his children as the pieces. Ultimately, Harold's greatest challenge is to instill a sense of unity and shared purpose among his potential heirs and the powerful nobles of the realm. He needs to make them see that their own prosperity is tied to the stability of the Godwinson monarchy. If he succeeds, he might lay the foundation for a dynasty that could rule England for generations. If he fails, the peace he fought so hard to win at Hastings could shatter upon his death, plunging England back into the turmoil of contested claims and the Civil War. The future of Saxon England rests not just on Harold's life, but on the wisdom of his planning for what comes after. He has faced down foreign invaders. Now he must conquer the more insidious threat of internal division. With Harold wrestling with the thorny issue of succession and trying to ensure his sons don't immediately start a royal rumble the moment he's gone, you can see England's place in the wider world begin to shift. The umbilical cord that, in our timeline, tied England so tightly to Norman and Capetian France for centuries has been, if not severed, then certainly frayed. England, under a Godwinson dynasty, begins to look in different directions for its friends, its enemies, and its cultural influences. You're now peering at a map of Europe in Harold's council room, and the lines of alliance and antagonism are being redrawn. The most immediate consequence of Harold's victory is, of course, a deep and lasting enmity with the Duchy of Normandy. The desire for revenge, which you saw earlier in those coastal raids, doesn't just evaporate. While the Normans might be too internally divided or wary to launch another full-scale invasion immediately, they remain a persistent threat. Any English king would need to maintain a strong southern defence and a capable fleet. This ongoing hostility naturally pushes England away from the sphere of influence of the French king, to whom the Duke of Normandy is, at least nominally, a vassal. Why cosy up to your enemy's boss, especially when that boss is often struggling to control his own powerful nobles like the Duke of Normandy? So, where does England look for allies? The most natural direction is north and east, towards Scandinavia. Harold Godwinson himself had strong Scandinavian connections. His mother, Gyða Thorkel's daughter, was from a powerful Danish noble family. His first wife, Edith Swanwick, also had Danish ties. He understood the Norse world. It's an established historical fact that there were close political, economic, and cultural links between England and Scandinavia for centuries through trade, settlement, the Danelaw, and even periods of shared monarchy, like under Canute the Great. Harold might actively seek to strengthen these ties. Imagine embassies travelling between London, Roskilde, the Danish capital, and Nidaros in Norway. Harold could propose trade agreements, mutual defence pacts, or even dynastic marriages. Perhaps one of his sons by Edith Swanwick, like Godwin or Magnus, who, in our timeline, fled to Denmark after 1066, could marry a Scandinavian princess. Or one of Harold's daughters could be wed to a Danish or Norwegian prince. This would create a northern bloc, a counterweight to Norman French power. English wool, grain, and silver might flow more readily to Scandinavian ports, and in return, England could secure timber, furs, and crucially military support, or at least neutrality from the Northmen. This renewed focus on Scandinavia could also mean a greater persistence of Norse cultural influences in England, in language, law, and storytelling. Remember those sagas? They might become even more popular at the English court. Another potential, though perhaps more complex area for alliance is the Holy Roman Empire. The emperor was often at odds with the papacy, and sometimes with the French kings. An independent England, also seeking to maintain its autonomy from excessive papal interference, even after Harold sorts out the Stigand mess, might find common ground with the emperor. This wouldn't necessarily be a warm and fuzzy friendship, more a pragmatic alignment of interests. Some scholars debate the extent of direct political engagement between Anglo-Saxon England and the Holy Roman Empire, but trade and ecclesiastical links certainly existed. Harold might try to expand these, seeing the empire as a powerful, if distant, friend. What about relations with the rest of France, beyond Normandy? They would likely be wary, but perhaps not overtly hostile unless provoked. The French kings of the Capetian dynasty were still consolidating their power, and often had their hands full managing their own powerful vassals, like the Duke of Aquitaine or the Count of Flanders. An England that is not a Norman possession is, in some ways, less of a direct threat to the French crown, as it removes the dangerous possibility of a single ruler controlling both Normandy and England. Trade would likely continue, as French wine was always popular in England, but diplomatic ties might be cooler, more formal. It's like having a difficult relationship with one of your neighbours. You might still wave politely to the rest of the street, but you're not inviting them over for a barbecue anytime soon. This shift in alliances, this pivot to the north, has significant long-term implications. England might become more integrated into a Scandinavian Germanic cultural and economic sphere, rather than the Franco-Latin one it was drawn into after 1066. Its foreign policy will be oriented differently. Instead of centuries of entanglement in French dynastic wars, like the 100 Years' War, England's continental concerns might focus more on the Baltic, the North Sea, and relations with the Empire. A quirky fringe tidbit: perhaps English fashion, instead of following Parisian trends, starts to incorporate more Scandinavian elements. More furs, more amber jewellery, more practical, seafaring-inspired clothing. Forget the pointy shoes of the Normans. Sensible woolen cloaks are all the rage. This relative isolation from mainland Western Europe, or at least the French parts of it, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It could foster a stronger sense of unique English identity. However, it might also mean that England is slower to adopt certain continental innovations, whether in military technology, scholastic philosophy, or artistic styles like Gothic architecture. Or conversely, it might develop its own unique responses to these trends, influenced more by its northern connections. England becomes less a province of a wider French-speaking world and more a distinct entity, charting its own course in the choppy waters of European politics, its gaze fixed more on the grey waves of the North Sea than the vineyards of Aquitaine. Harold's victory at Hastings didn't just save England, it subtly tilted its axis in the world. With England's diplomatic compass reorienting towards the north and east, let's delve into the very fabric of its society, the laws of the land. You find yourself in a shire court, perhaps in a draughty wooden hall somewhere in Wessex. The reeve is presiding, a local fen of some importance. Disputes are being settled, judgments rendered, not according to some newly imposed Norman legal code, but by the ancient customs and statutes of the Anglo-Saxons. This continuity in law is a profound consequence of Harold's victory. The Norman Conquest, in our timeline, brought about a seismic shift in English law. William and his successors introduced Norman feudal law, with its concepts of land tenure based on service to the king, its primogeniture, the eldest son inheriting everything, and its separate forest law that reserved vast tracts of land for royal hunting, much to the chagrin of the peasantry. They also brought a more centralised, top-down legal system, eventually leading to the development of common law, but with a heavy Norman French imprint, especially in its language and early procedures. Many of the legal terms we use today, plaintiff, defendant, attorney, felony, jury, though the concept had Anglo-Saxon roots, have French origins. But in Harold's England, this legal Gallicisation never happens. Anglo-Saxon law, a Germanic system, continues to evolve on its own terms. It's an established historical fact that pre-conquest England had a sophisticated legal system, with written law codes dating back to Ethelbert of Kent in the early 7th century. These laws dealt with a wide range of issues, from vergild, compensation paid to a victim's family for injury or death, with amounts varying based on social rank, to theft, land disputes, and the responsibilities of kinship groups. This system, while perhaps appearing somewhat chaotic to Norman eyes, focused on centralised royal authority, was deeply embedded in English society. So, what does this legal continuity look like? For one, the language of the law remains English. Law codes, charters, and court proceedings are predominantly in the vernacular, not Latin or French. This makes the law more accessible, at least in theory, to a wider segment of the population, not just a clerical or francophone elite. You might still have a scribe who sounds like he's gargling gravel, trying to pronounce all those old English legal terms, but at least it's your own gravel. The emphasis on community and kinship in dispute resolution might persist longer. 100 courts and shire courts, local assemblies where freemen had a voice and judgment, was often by a group of peers or compurgators, oath helpers who would swear to the defendant's innocence, would remain central. While royal justice was growing under later Anglo-Saxon kings, the local element was strong. This could mean a more decentralised legal landscape, with more regional variation in custom, but also potentially a greater sense of popular participation in the legal process. Some scholars debate how truly popular these assemblies were, or if they were largely dominated by local elites. But the ideal of community justice was certainly present. Concepts like verguild might continue as a primary means of settling feuds, rather than solely relying on capital punishment or imprisonment imposed by remote royal authority. This doesn't mean a lawless society. Verguild was a complex system designed to prevent endless cycles of revenge by assigning a monetary value to human life and injury. It's a different approach to justice, focused as much on compensation and social cohesion as on punishment. Though, one imagines haggling over the verguild for a particularly annoying neighbour could get quite heated. His life was only worth 3 cows? Surely you jest, he snored terribly. Without the imposition of Norman feudalism, land law would also develop differently. The Anglo-Saxon system had its own forms of land tenure, including bookland, land held by charter, often by nobles or the church, and folkland, land held according to customary rules, perhaps with more communal rights. While a form of lordship and dependency certainly existed, thanes serving earls and earls serving the king, the rigid hierarchical feudal pyramid introduced by the Normans, where all land was ultimately held from the king in return for military service, might not take root in the same way. This could lead to a different distribution of land ownership, perhaps with a larger class of independent free peasant proprietors, ceorls, persisting for longer. The Domesday Book, that vast Norman survey of English landholdings undertaken for taxation and control, would never be commissioned. English land records would continue along their own, perhaps less systematic but more organic path. A quirky fringe tidbit in this legal landscape could be the survival of certain superstitious or folklore practices in official proceedings for longer than they might have otherwise. For example, the ordeal, while already criticised by some churchmen, might linger as a method of proof in criminal cases if there aren't enough oath helpers. Perhaps even specific local ordeals, like an ordeal by water at a particularly holy well, or, as mentioned before, the ordeal by cursed morsel, like Godwin's unfortunate snack, might persist in local custom, much to the frustration of more enlightened royal judges attempting to promote more rational forms of evidence. You can almost hear a exasperated King Harold sighing, "Not the sacred chickens again, Sheriff Ethelstan." The development of royal justice would still occur under a strong Godwinson dynasty. Kings always seek to consolidate power, but it would grow out of existing Anglo-Saxon institutions, like the king's itinerant justices, rather than being an alien imposition. The legal system would be recognisably English, rooted in centuries of native tradition, rather than a Norman superstructure built upon an Anglo-Saxon foundation. This doesn't mean it's necessarily better or worse. Both systems had their strengths and weaknesses, but it would be profoundly different, shaping the relationship between the people, the law, and the state in ways that would echo down the centuries. The shouts in the courtroom are in English, the fines are calculated in shillings and pence, and the ultimate appeal is to the King's English justice, not some distant Norman-French concept of droit. With the laws of the land firmly rooted in Anglo-Saxon tradition, let's lift our gaze from the dusty law books and look at the physical landscape of this alternate England. What does it look like? You're standing on a hill overlooking a bustling town, or perhaps wandering through the precincts of a great monastery. The buildings, the layout of the streets, the very feel of the place, it's subtly and in some ways profoundly different from the England shaped by Norman hands. The most obvious architectural absence in Harold's England is the widespread proliferation of stone castles. It's an established historical fact that the Normans were prolific castle builders, and these structures became symbols of their domination over the conquered English population. The Motte and Bailey Castle, that classic mound with a wooden or stone keep on top, surrounded by a fortified enclosure, was a Norman import, quick to erect and brutally effective at suppressing dissent. Within a few decades of 1066, hundreds of these castles scarred the English landscape, from the mighty Tower of London to smaller fortifications controlling key roads and river crossings. In Harold's England, this wave of castle building simply doesn't happen. Anglo-Saxon defensive structures, known as burhs, like those established by Alfred the Great against the Vikings, were typically fortified towns or enclosures, often utilising earthworks and timber palisades, sometimes with stone gatehouses. While some Anglo-Saxon nobles did have private fortified residences, Fegans burhs, they weren't castles in the Norman sense. Without the imperative of a foreign occupying force needing to control a restive population, the architectural emphasis remains on communal defence and royal administrative centres rather than private fortresses of an alien aristocracy. So the skyline is different. You don't see those grim grey stone keeps looming over every major town. Instead, towns might be larger, more sprawling, perhaps with more substantial town walls of earth and timber, possibly later upgraded with stone in prosperous areas. Royal residences and the halls of great earls would be impressive complexes, but likely built more in the tradition of the Anglo-Saxon Great Hall. Large, aisled timber structures, perhaps with some stone elements for prestige or defence, but not the compact vertical fortresses of the Normans. Think more Heorot from Beowulf, but on a grander, more permanent scale, with associated chapels, workshops, and agricultural buildings. Perhaps a bit like the surviving, though later, timber-framed halls of Scandinavia or Germany. Church architecture would also follow a different trajectory. Pre-conquest England had a vibrant tradition of stone church building, often characterised by tall, narrow proportions, long and short work, quoins, cornerstones, and distinctive decorative features like strip work and stone carving. Famous examples include Earl's Barton Church, or the original Westminster Abbey built by Edward the Confessor, which Harold had just seen consecrated before his coronation. Without the Norman Conquest, which brought with it the Romanesque style, often called Norman architecture in Britain, with its massive round arches, thick pillars, and ambitious vaulting, English church architecture will continue to evolve from its Anglo-Saxon roots. It might develop its own unique style, perhaps influenced by ongoing contact with Scandinavia or the Germanic lands of the empire. You might see taller, more slender towers, more intricate surface decoration, and perhaps a different approach to vaulting and interior space. Some scholars debate whether Anglo-Saxon architecture was already moving towards some features associated with Romanesque before 1066, but the Norman influx undeniably imposed a new, dominant style. In this timeline, native trends continue, leading to churches that feel distinctly English or perhaps Anglo-Scandinavian rather than Norman. Imagine magnificent wooden roof cathedrals, richly carved and painted, or stone churches with unique window tracery and sculptural programs drawing on English saints and legends rather than continental models. The masons are still busy, but their blueprints look different. Infrastructure development, like roads and bridges, would continue under royal patronage, but perhaps with a different focus. The Romans had built excellent roads, many of which were still in use. Anglo-Saxon kings maintained some of these and built new ones, often for military and administrative purposes. Without the Norman impetus to rapidly connect their newly conquered territories with castles and garrisons, road development might be more organic, perhaps focusing more on facilitating trade between established market towns. Maybe the old Roman roads, instead of being systematically maintained for Norman military logistics, fall into further disrepair in some areas, while new, more locally relevant routes are prioritised. You might have to navigate using slightly more dubious directions from a local who insists it's just over yonder, past the slightly suspicious-looking oak tree, a quirky fringe tidbit. Without the harsh Norman forest law, which reserved vast areas for the king's hunt and imposed brutal penalties for poaching, England might retain more of its ancient woodland for longer, or see it managed differently. This could affect everything from the availability of timber for building, perhaps leading to even more ambitious timber architecture, to the folklore and daily lives of rural communities. You might have more Robin Hood-esque figures, though perhaps less robbing from the rich Normans, and more arguing with the king's reeve about firewood rights, and a different relationship with the wildwood. Perhaps more tales of mysterious creatures and hermits living in these extensive forests, which remain a tangible part of the local economy and imagination rather than a forbidden royal playground. The very layout of towns and villages might evolve differently. Norman town planning often involved clearing areas to build castles and cathedrals, sometimes imposing a more regular street grid. In an England developing along Anglo-Saxon lines, towns might grow more organically, their street patterns following ancient trackways and property boundaries, leading to more winding, picturesque, or, if you're trying to find your way, utterly confusing, layouts. This isn't to say there's no planning. Anglo-Saxon burhs were often laid out on a grid, but the subsequent development might be less drastically reshaped by foreign imposition. The landscape of Harold's England is one of continuity, of native styles evolving, of a land shaped by its own people and their traditions, not by the dictates of conquerors. The buildings speak English, as it were, in their form and materials. As England carves its own path in architecture and law, free from Norman overlordship, let's consider the machinery of its governance, specifically the role of the Witanegmot, or Witan. You're now sitting in on a session of this great council, perhaps convened by an ageing King Harold or one of his successors. The air is thick with debate, nobles in their finest tunics, bishops in their ecclesiastical robes, all gathered to advise the king, and, crucially, to give their consent to major decisions. In an England where the king owes his throne to English valour rather than foreign conquest, the Witan's power might just be on an upward trajectory. The Witenagemot, literally meeting of wise men, was the key political assembly of Anglo-Saxon England. It wasn't a parliament in the modern sense, with elected representatives. Rather, it was composed of the most powerful figures in the land: the ealdormen, later earls, the king's thanes, his warrior nobles, bishops, and abbots. It's an established historical fact that the Witan had significant functions. It advised the king on policy, consented to laws and taxes, played a crucial role in electing, or at least acclaiming, new kings, and could even, in rare cases, depose an unsatisfactory one. Its power waxed and waned depending on the strength of the ruling monarch. A strong king might dominate the Witan, while a weak one could find himself at its mercy. In the immediate aftermath of Harold's victory at Hastings, a victory achieved by the collective effort of the English nobility and fyrd, the Witan's prestige would be high. Harold, though a strong leader, would need their continued support to rebuild the kingdom, counter Norman raids, and manage internal affairs like the succession. He wouldn't be able to simply rule by decree in the way William the Conqueror, with his army of occupation, often could. William replaced the English aristocracy with his Norman followers, effectively sidelining the Witan and transforming it into his Curia Regis King's Council, dominated by his own tenants-in-chief. But in Harold's England, the native aristocracy remains in place. The earls, men like Edwin and Morcar, if they behave themselves, or new men elevated by Harold for their loyalty and service, retain their power bases and their expectation of being consulted. This creates a different dynamic between king and council. Harold and his Godwinson successors would likely need to govern more consensually, persuading and negotiating with the Witan, rather than simply dictating to it. Think of it as a medieval board of directors that actually has teeth and isn't just there to rubber stamp the CEO's decisions. They might even grumble if the mead served during long sessions isn't up to scratch. This could lead to a more formal codification of the Witan's rights and responsibilities. Perhaps, over time, certain procedures become entrenched. The king must consult the Witan on matters of war and peace, or before imposing new taxes. This isn't to say England would magically become a constitutional monarchy overnight. The king is still the divinely anointed ruler. But the balance of power might be subtly different, with the aristocracy, through the Witan, acting as a more effective check on royal authority than they did under the highly centralised Norman regime. Some scholars debate whether the Norman Conquest ultimately strengthened or weakened the path towards parliamentary democracy in England, with arguments on both sides. In this timeline, an empowered Witan could be an earlier step towards a more representative, albeit still elitist, form of government. Imagine a scenario where one of Harold's less capable sons inherits the throne. The Witan might step in to guide him, or even appoint a regent from among their own ranks if the king is too young or incompetent. This could prevent the kind of disastrous reigns that sometimes plagued medieval monarchies. Or, conversely, a powerful faction within the Witan could try to usurp royal power, leading to periods of instability. Power sharing is never a simple business. A quirky fringe tidbit, the meeting places of the Witan might become even more significant. Anglo-Saxon kings didn't have a fixed capital like London until later. The court and the Witan often travelled, meeting at various royal estates or important towns like Winchester, Gloucester, or even in the open air at traditional assembly sites. Without the Norman focus on London as the primary seat of power, symbolised by the Tower of London, this tradition of a peripatetic Witan might continue for longer. This could mean that different regions feel more connected to the central government, as the wise men literally come to their doorstep periodically. It also means a logistical nightmare for the royal household, constantly packing up the tapestries and the good silver. Perhaps a particularly influential Witan member from, say, York, successfully lobbies for more meetings to be held up north, citing the superior quality of the local ale as a key factor. The composition of the Witan might also evolve. Perhaps, over time, representatives from prosperous trading towns, or even from the ranks of the more substantial free peasantry, the ceorls, begin to find a voice, if not direct representation. If England remains more focused on trade with Scandinavia and the Low Countries, the merchant class could grow in influence, and they would naturally seek to protect their interests through the kingdom's main consultative body. This is speculative, of course, but the seeds of a broader political participation could be sown in an institution that isn't dominated by a foreign military aristocracy. The Witan, then, in Harold's England, is not a relic of the past, but a vital, evolving institution. It's the forum where the king and the kingdom's powerful engage, where consensus is forged, or fails to be, and where the direction of the realm is debated. It could become a bulwark against tyranny, or a hotbed of aristocratic factionalism. But whatever its path, its continued prominence ensures that the governance of England retains a distinctly native character, a legacy of Anglo-Saxon political tradition rather than Norman imposition. The wise men continue to meet, and their voices continue to shape the destiny of the English people. With the Witan potentially flexing its muscles a bit more in domestic affairs, let's turn our gaze outwards again, across the narrow sea, or the English Channel, if you prefer the later term. Though, narrow sea has a nice, salty ring to it, doesn't it? How does Harold's England, an England that repelled Norman ambitions, interact with the Kingdom of France, the sprawling, often fractious realm from which William the Almost Conqueror hailed? The relationship is bound to be complicated, like that one cousin you only see at weddings and funerals, and you're never quite sure if you should hug or just nod awkwardly. In our timeline, the Norman Conquest bound England and France together in a complex, often violent embrace for centuries. English kings, as dukes of Normandy and later rulers of other vast French territories like Aquitaine, were technically vassals of the French crown for their continental holdings. This led to an absurd situation where the King of England, a sovereign in his own right, owed homage to the King of France, leading to endless wars, rivalries, and a deep entanglement of their respective destinies. The 100 Years' War was the most dramatic expression of this dysfunctional relationship. But in Harold's England, this primary cause of conflict is absent. the King of England is not also the Duke of Normandy. He holds no significant lands in France. This fundamentally changes the dynamic. There's no inherent subordination, no built-in casus belli arising from feudal obligations on French soil. This doesn't mean eternal peace breaks out, of course. This is the 11th century, after all. But the nature of the relationship is different. It's more a relationship between two distinct, sovereign entities, albeit with a very grumpy Normandy sitting in between them, geographically and temperamentally. Trade would likely continue, and perhaps even flourish, on a more equal footing. It's an established historical fact that there was considerable cross-channel trade long before 1066, with English wool, tin, and agricultural produce being exchanged for French wine, luxury goods, and other commodities. This trade was too lucrative for either side to want to disrupt it completely, even with political tensions. English merchants would still sail to Rouen, the Norman capital, but also a key French trading hub on the Seine, Bordeaux for wine, naturally, and other French ports. French merchants would still find their way to London, Southampton, and Bristol. The flow of goods and the accompanying flow of people and ideas, though perhaps fewer Norman ideas are welcome in England now, would persist. You might see English traders becoming quite adept at a bit of pidgin French, just enough to haggle over the price of a good claret, though they'd probably still grumble about those shifty continentals under their breath. Diplomatic relations would be cautious. The French kings of the Capetian dynasty, like Philip I, would likely be quite pleased, privately, that William the Bastard failed in England. A too powerful Duke of Normandy, especially one who also controlled the wealth and resources of England, was a major threat to the French crown's own authority. William's defeat weakens a key rival vassal. So the French king might initially see Harold's England as a useful counterweight to Norman power. He might even send polite, if non-committal, embassies to Harold's court. Sorry to hear about your spot of bother with our enthusiastic Norman cousin. Glad you sorted it out. Lovely weather you're having. However, this doesn't mean the French king becomes England's best friend. Normandy, though defeated in its English ambitions, remains a powerful duchy and an integral, if often rebellious, part of the French kingdom. The French king cannot afford to alienate the Normans completely. So, his policy towards England would likely be one of careful balancing. He might offer tacit support to Harold if it suits his interests against Normandy, but he's unlikely to enter into a formal alliance that would drag him into open conflict with his own Norman vassals on England's behalf. Some scholars debate the actual power and reach of the early Capetian kings, often portraying them as struggling to assert authority beyond their own royal domain around Paris and Orleans. A weakened Normandy might actually allow the French king to assert more control within his own realm. A quirky fringe tidbit: courtly culture in England might develop differently. In our timeline, the Norman influence brought French poetry, chivalric romances, and continental taste in music and manners to the English court. Without this direct pipeline, English courtly culture might retain more of its Germanic and Scandinavian character for longer. More Mead Hall sagas, perhaps, and less troubadour poetry about unrequited love for distant ladies. Or it might absorb influences from other directions, perhaps from the Low Countries or the Rhineland, through trade and alliance. Imagine English nobles trying to learn complex German drinking songs instead of French ballads. the results could be interesting. Over time, as the memory of Hastings fades, though not for the Normans, who likely have long memories and a strong sense of grievance, the relationship could normalise. There might be dynastic marriages between the English royal family and lesser French noble houses, though probably not the Capetians themselves initially, and certainly not the Norman ducal family. There could be cooperation on issues of mutual interest, such as piracy in the Channel, or dealing with unruly Flanders. But the fundamental difference remains. England is not looking over its shoulder at a French king to whom it owes allegiance. It meets France on the diplomatic stage as an equal, or at least as an independent power. This frees up English resources and attention that, in our timeline, were poured into continental wars. That energy can be directed elsewhere, towards consolidating power within the British Isles, expanding trade networks, or developing its own unique cultural and political institutions. The narrow sea is a true border, a separation, not a bridge for dynastic claims and feudal entanglements. Harold's victory ensured that England's destiny would be shaped primarily in England, not in the chanceries and battlefields of France. With England navigating its relationships with its continental neighbours on a new footing, let's consider how it responds to one of the defining movements of the High Middle Ages, the Crusades. You're at Harold's court, or perhaps that of his son or grandson. News arrives, carried by travelling priests or merchants, of Pope Urban II's call at Clermont in 1095, if the timeline roughly aligns, for Christian knights to march east and reclaim Jerusalem from the Seljuk Turks. How does a Saxon England, an England that fought off a holy invasion blessed by a previous pope, react to this new call to arms? In our timeline, the Norman knights and aristocracy were enthusiastic participants in the First Crusade and subsequent crusading movements. Men like Robert Curthose, William the Conqueror's son and Duke of Normandy, Stephen of Blois, and Bohemond of Taranto were key figures. For them, it was a combination of religious zeal, a thirst for adventure, a desire for land and plunder, and a way to channel their martial energies. England, under Norman rule, contributed men and resources to these expeditions. Richard the Lionheart, though a later king, is perhaps the most iconic English crusader. Though he was very French in culture and spent little time in England. But Harold's England might have a very different take on the Crusades. Firstly, there's the lingering suspicion of papal motives. Harold had seen firsthand how a pope, Alexander II, could be persuaded to back an invasion of England under the guise of religious legitimacy. While Harold and his successors would have mended fences with Rome, as discussed with the Stegern issue, a certain wariness might remain. Another grand adventure blessed by the Pope, you say? And who benefits this time might be the unspoken question in the Royal Council. It's like being wary of a salesman who previously sold you a faulty product with a divine guarantee. Secondly, England's primary military focus is likely still defensive. The Norman threat from across the Channel, though perhaps diminished, hasn't vanished. There are ongoing concerns about the Scottish border and potential unrest in the north or Wales. Sending a significant contingent of experienced knights and fighting men on a perilous, expensive, and very distant expedition to the Holy Land might seem like a strategic folly when there are pressing dangers closer to home. Harold's successors might feel they can't afford to export their best warriors. It's an established historical fact that crusading was incredibly costly in terms of manpower and finances for those who participated. For a kingdom still consolidating its independence and facing local threats, it would be a huge drain. This doesn't mean there would be zero English participation. Individual piety was strong. Some English knights or nobles, fired by religious fervour or a taste for adventure, perhaps younger sons with no land inheritance to look forward to, might decide to take the cross and join contingents from other parts of Europe, like Flanders or the Empire, with whom England has closer ties. You might see a few hardy English Thegns, perhaps with a company of their housecarls, making their way to Constantinople, their battle axes and long seax knives looking distinctly out of place among the kite shields and lances of French and German knights. They might even grumble that the falafel in Antioch isn't as good as a proper English meat pie. But a large-scale, officially sanctioned and funded English crusade, led by the king or prominent earls, is less likely. The King of England might offer prayers, perhaps even some financial contributions to the papacy for the cause, as a diplomatic gesture. But his main priority is the security and prosperity of his own realm. Some scholars debate the true motivations of many crusaders, suggesting that while religious faith was a factor, worldly ambitions for land, wealth, and status were often equally, if not more, important. In Harold's England, those ambitions can perhaps be satisfied closer to home by serving the crown, expanding trade, or even, as we'll see later, dealing with infidels or rivals in the Celtic lands. A quirky fringe tidbit. The legends and stories that filter back from the Crusades might take on a distinctly English flavour if told by the few returning adventurers. Instead of purely French-style chivalric romances, you might get more sagas-like accounts, emphasising gritty determination, loyalty to one's lord, and perhaps a healthy dose of scepticism about the more miraculous events. Imagine an old English thane, back from Jerusalem, telling stories in the mead hall, not of delicate damsels and courtly love, but of shield bites, hard marches, and the practical difficulties of keeping your mail rust-free in a desert climate. Aye, the Holy Sepulchre was grand, but have you ever tried to bargain for a decent water skin in colloquial Arabic? That's a true test of faith, that is. The lack of significant English involvement in the early Crusades would have several long-term consequences. England would be less exposed to the cultural and intellectual currents flowing back from the East, the Arabic learning, the new technologies, the different artistic styles that the Crusades helped to disseminate in Europe. This isn't to say England would be a complete backwater, as trade and other contacts would still exist, but it might miss out on some of that specific Crusader-driven exchange. Furthermore, England's relationship with the papacy might remain more transactional and less emotionally charged. Without the shared experience of crusading, and the figure of the Crusader king, like Richard I, the spiritual authority of the Pope might be respected, but perhaps not revered with the same intensity as in kingdoms more deeply involved in the Holy Wars. England's religious identity might remain more locally focused, centred on its own saints and traditions, rather than being so heavily invested in the fate of distant Jerusalem. This different approach to the Crusades subtly alters England's place in Christendom. It becomes a kingdom perhaps seen as more insular, more pragmatic, less caught up in the grand, sweeping religious enterprises of the continent. Harold's victory at Hastings created an England that has to prioritise its own survival and consolidation, and that means the call to crusade, however divinely inspired, might find a less receptive audience on its shores. The Saracens in the Holy Land might be a concern for God, but the Normans just across the water are a concern for the King of England. While Harold's England might be less inclined to send its warriors to distant Jerusalem, there are plenty of infidels and troublesome neighbours much closer to home, the Celtic peoples of Wales and Ireland. With no Norman marcher lords aggressively carving out estates on the Welsh border, and no strongbow leading a Norman-backed invasion of Ireland, the relationship between England and its Celtic neighbours unfolds along a very different, though not necessarily more peaceful, trajectory. You're now on the rugged borderlands of Wales, or perhaps looking across the Irish Sea, and the dynamics of power are shifting. Let's start with Wales. It's an established historical fact that the pre-Norman Welsh principalities were often fragmented and engaged in internal power struggles, but they also frequently raided into England and resisted English encroachment. Harold Godwinson himself had significant experience fighting the Welsh. In the 1050s and 1060s, he campaigned successfully against Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, the powerful Welsh king who had united much of Wales and was a serious threat to English border counties. Harold's victory over Gruffydd, whose widow, Ealdgyth, Harold later married, remember, had temporarily pacified the Welsh threat before 1066. In this new timeline, without the relentless pressure of Norman marcher lords building castles and seizing land piece by piece, the Welsh principalities might remain more independent for longer. The Norman strategy in Wales was one of aggressive colonisation and military subjugation. Harold's approach, or that of his successors, might be different. Having secured England's borders against the Normans and Scots, the Godwinson kings might adopt a policy more akin to containment and establishing spheres of influence rather than outright conquest. They might seek to create buffer zones, perhaps by supporting friendly Welsh rulers against rivals, or by establishing fortified English settlements in key border areas, but without the same drive for total domination that characterised the Norman advance. This doesn't mean peace. Welsh raids into Herefordshire, Shropshire and Cheshire would likely continue whenever English royal power seemed weak or distracted, and English kings would undoubtedly retaliate, leading to punitive expeditions into Wales. But the nature of the conflict might be more like the traditional border warfare that had existed for centuries, rather than a systematic conquest. Welsh culture and language might thrive more robustly in the absence of intense Norman pressure to Anglicise. The great Welsh poetic traditions, the tales of the Mabinogion, could flourish in a land that, while often at war, retains a greater degree of political autonomy. Some scholars debate whether a unified Welsh identity was a product of resisting English Norman aggression, or if it predated it. Either way, continued English pressure of a different kind would still shape it. A quirky fringe tidbit for Wales. Perhaps some of the more enterprising or desperate Welsh princes, seeing the ongoing Norman nuisance raids on England's south coast, might try a bit of freelance raiding themselves, but allying with Norman sea raiders for joint ventures. Imagine a bizarre temporary alliance of convenience. Welsh longbowmen and Norman men-at-arms, splitting the loot from a particularly wealthy English coastal monastery. You take the silver candlesticks, Guillaume, we'll have the sheep. And nobody mentioned this to King Harold, or King Bledin ap Cynfyn for that matter. Stranger alliances have happened in the pursuit of plunder. Now let's look across the Irish Sea. In our timeline, the Norman invasion of Ireland began in 1169, initiated by Richard de Clare, Strongbow, at the invitation of a deposed Irish king, Dermot MacMurrough. This led to centuries of English, and later British, involvement and eventual domination in Ireland. Without a powerful expansionist Norman aristocracy in England looking for new lands and opportunities, this specific catalyst for invasion disappears. This doesn't mean Ireland is left entirely to its own devices. Pre-Norman Ireland was a patchwork of rival kingdoms, often engaged in their own internal and inter-kingdom warfare. There were also significant Viking settlements like Dublin, Waterford and Limerick, which were major trading hubs. An English kingdom under Harold, particularly one with strong Scandinavian ties, would certainly have continued trade and diplomatic contact with these Hiberno Norse ports and with various Irish kings. English churchmen might still travel to Ireland, and Irish scholars and monks to England, continuing a long tradition of cultural exchange. However, the impetus for a large-scale English military intervention is much reduced. Harold's England is more concerned with its own borders and its relationships with Normandy and Scandinavia. It lacks the land-hungry Norman baronage that spearheaded the Irish invasion in our reality. So, Ireland might continue its own complex political evolution for much longer, free from large-scale English interference. The High Kingship of Ireland might become a more stable and powerful institution, or the island might remain a vibrant, if often violent, collection of competing local powers. Historians still argue about the level of political centralisation in Ireland before the Norman invasion and what its trajectory might have been without external interference. This doesn't preclude all conflict. English fishermen might clash with Irish rivals. English traders might get caught up in local Irish disputes. There might even be occasional English punitive raids in response to Irish piracy, or raids on the Welsh or English coasts. Some Irish kings were not averse to a bit of cross-water raiding themselves. But the idea of a concerted English conquest of Ireland is far less likely in the 12th or 13th centuries. Ireland remains a Celtic neighbour, sometimes friendly, sometimes hostile, a source of trade, and perhaps a refuge for English political exiles, as it was for Harold's sons briefly in our timeline, but not a target for systematic colonisation by a Godwinson dynasty focused on other priorities. The long-term implications for both Wales and Ireland are immense. They develop with less direct English political and military domination, allowing their native institutions, laws and cultures to evolve more independently, at least for a while. This could lead to very different national identities and political landscapes in the British Isles centuries down the line. The Celtic question, for Harold's England, is less about conquest and assimilation, and more about managing complex, often fractious, relationships with its independent Western neighbours. Centuries have now passed since that fateful October day on Coolbeck Hill. The immediate consequences of Harold's victory have rippled outwards, creating an England, and indeed a Europe, that is subtly but significantly different. Let's try to imagine what the world looks like, say around the 15th or 16th century, a period that in our timeline saw the Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, and the Reformation. How has Harold's legacy, the survival of Saxon England, shaped this new era, particularly regarding England's gaze towards the vast, uncharted Atlantic? In our timeline, the impetus for England's eventual transatlantic exploration and colonisation came from a variety of factors. Rivalry with Spain and Portugal, the desire for new trade routes to Asia, economic ambition, and a burgeoning sense of national confidence. The Norman influence, with its continental connections and outward-looking expansionist tendencies, arguably played a role in shaping this mindset over the centuries. England, by the 15th and 16th centuries, was a major European power, toughened by continental wars, like the 100 Years' War, which wouldn't have happened in the same way, if at all, in this timeline, and with a developing naval tradition. But Harold's England has followed a different path. Its foreign policy has been more focused on the North Sea and Baltic regions, its continental entanglements less about vast territorial claims in France, and more about managing relationships with Normandy, the French kingdom, and the Holy Roman Empire. Its naval strength, developed initially to counter Norman raids, and then to support its Scandinavian-oriented trade, is significant, but its primary operational theatre has been European waters. It's an established historical fact that the Tudor monarchs, building on earlier foundations, heavily invested in the English navy, which was crucial for later exploration and empire. Would a Godwinson dynasty, perhaps still reigning after several centuries, or a successor dynasty that emerged from that Saxon matrix, have the same motivations or capabilities? Perhaps the drive for Atlantic exploration emerges later in this England. Without the intense rivalry with a Castile-Aragon, Spain, that was forged in the crucible of the Reconquista and then burst onto the Atlantic scene, England might feel less immediate pressure to find alternative routes to the east or to compete for new territories. If England's trade is comfortably oriented towards Scandinavia, the Hanseatic League, a powerful medieval trading bloc in northern Europe, which might be an even closer English ally in this timeline, and the Low Countries, the lure of risky Atlantic voyages might seem less appealing, or at least less urgent. Remember all the English wool going to Flanders. That's a pretty stable income, less risky than chasing rumours of gold in unknown lands. This doesn't mean English sailors are not adventurous. The descendants of Vikings and Anglo-Saxons are no strangers to long sea voyages. They would certainly know of Iceland and Greenland, discovered and settled by Norsemen. They might even have legends like the Irish tales of St Brendan or Welsh stories of Madoc, hinting at lands further west. But is there the royal patronage, the investment from a wealthy merchant class, the overarching geopolitical strategy to turn these whispers into systematic exploration? Some scholars debate whether isolated pre-Columbian transatlantic voyages occurred, but sustained contact and colonisation were a different matter entirely. A quirky fringe tidbit? In this Saxon England, perhaps the legends of Vinland from the Norse sagas are more widely known and taken more seriously. With stronger and more continuous ties to Scandinavia, these accounts of Leif Erikson's voyages to North America around 1000 AD might be part of the popular consciousness, not just obscure texts. This could mean that when the technological and economic conditions are right, the idea of sailing west isn't entirely novel, but rather a rediscovery of something known to their northern cousins. Maybe English fishermen, pushing further and further west in search of cod, are the first to officially stumble upon the coast of North America, guided by half-remembered Norse tales, rather than Genoese navigators employed by the Spanish crown. They might not plant a flag and claim it for King Ethelred IV, but they definitely note the good fishing grounds. The Reformation, or something like it, might also play out differently. In our timeline, Henry VIII's break with Rome was driven by dynastic concerns and a desire for royal supremacy. If Harold England sorted out its relationship with the papacy in the 11th century on more independent terms, perhaps the later pressures for ecclesiastical reform take a different course. A native English church, less dominated by foreign appointees, and with a stronger tradition of vernacular scripture and preaching, remember the linguistic continuity, might undergo its own internal reforms, or be more resistant to certain papal assertions without the same kind of dramatic political break. This, in turn, could affect England's relationships with other European powers and its motivations for overseas expansion, which in our timeline were sometimes fueled by religious rivalry, e.g. with Catholic Spain. So, does John Cabot, or his Saxon equivalent, perhaps Leofric Chandler, sail from Bristol in 1497? Maybe. Or maybe he sails 50 years later. Or perhaps the first English expeditions are more focused on finding a northern passage around Scandinavia to Asia, leveraging their existing knowledge of Arctic waters. Or it's possible that England remains a more introspective, European-focused power for longer, content with its regional influence and trade, while other nations, perhaps a still powerful Hanseatic League, or even a resurgent Scandinavian Union, take the lead in Atlantic exploration. The world map of this 16th century might show different flags planted on American shores, or perhaps fewer flags altogether for a while. The great colonial empires that shaped so much of modern history might arise later, or be dominated by different European players. Harold Godwinson's victory was for England, but its echoes, centuries later, could mean that the New World remains newer for longer, its encounter with Europe unfolding at a different pace, and with different protagonists. The ripples from that one arrow, or axe blow, at Hastings continue to spread across the globe, charting an unfamiliar course for the future. And so, as the mists of conjecture begin to thin, we find ourselves looking back, not just over a few hypothetical centuries, but at the culmination of 1,000 years of divergent history. The England that stands in this alternate modern day, an England that grew from Harold's hard-won victory, is a place both familiar and strangely alien. The echoes of that Saxon world, which in our timeline faded into a romanticised past, here resonate in the language, the laws, the very spirit of the people. You're no longer on a battlefield or in a king's council, but perhaps just observing everyday life, feeling the subtle, pervasive differences. The English language, as we imagined, would be a more purely Germanic tongue, its cadence and vocabulary owing less to Paris and more to Hamburg or Oslo. Shakespeare, if such a genius arose, would have penned his sonnets and plays in words that might sound to us like a fusion of Chaucer and Old Norse, rich with kennings and alliteration, perhaps with fewer abstract Latinic constructions. The great works of English literature would draw on a different wellspring of myth and legend. Beowulf and the Norse sagas might be as central to the literary canon as Arthurian romance, which itself might have a more Brythonic, less French chivalric flavour if it developed without Norman influence. The legal system, evolving from its Anglo-Saxon roots, might place a greater emphasis on community justice and consensus, perhaps with a stronger tradition of local governance and less centralised royal authority than the system forged by Norman and Plantagenet kings. The Witan, or its evolved successor, could be a parliamentary body with a unique history, its powers and procedures shaped by centuries of negotiation between crown and nobility, and perhaps eventually a wider populace without the sharp break and refoundation of the Norman Conquest. Historians still argue whether the seeds of English common law and parliamentary democracy were primarily Anglo-Saxon or Norman. In this world, the Anglo-Saxon contribution is undeniable and unbroken. England's relationship with the continent of Europe would be different. Less entangled in French affairs, perhaps more closely allied with Scandinavian and Germanic powers, its foreign policy and its very identity would have a northern European tilt. It might never have possessed a vast overseas empire in the way the British Empire of our timeline developed. Its transatlantic ambitions, if they emerged, might have been later, or shared with different partners, or focused on different regions. The global map of power and influence could be redrawn, with other nations rising to prominence where Britain once did, or with a more multipolar world emerging sooner. Maybe the dominant global language isn't English, but Spanish, or French, or even a Creole developed in the Hanseatic trading posts. Culturally, this England might be more, Saxon. Its architecture, its music, its folk traditions would have evolved along a different path. Perhaps stone castles are rare, but magnificent timber halls and uniquely styled churches dot the landscape. Its national heroes might be different. Fewer crusading Richards, more steadfast Harolds and wise Elfrids. The national character, if one dared generalise, might be perceived as more stoic, perhaps a little dour, but also fiercely independent with a deep-rooted sense of ancient liberties. That quirky pub down the road? It might have a name like Thane Ethelred's Rest, and serve a particularly potent kind of unfiltered Saxon ale. The recipe unchanged for centuries. The British Isles themselves would have a different internal dynamic. Wales and Ireland, having experienced a different, perhaps less aggressively colonial, relationship with this Saxon England, would have their own unique histories and trajectories. Scotland, always a distinct kingdom, would have faced a southern neighbour with a different set of priorities and alliances. The very concept of Britishness, as it emerged in our timeline, forged in part through shared Protestantism, empire, and rivalry with continental powers, might not exist, or exist in a vastly different form. Of course, this is all speculation, a gentle journey into the what-ifs of history. Harold Godwinson's victory in 1066 would not have created a utopia. This alternate England would have faced its own trials, its own wars, its own injustices. Power would still corrupt, ambition would still drive conflict, and human nature, with all its flaws and glories, would remain unchanged. But the context would be different. The foundations upon which its society was built would be those laid down by centuries of Anglo-Saxon development rather than the Norman reset. It's a reminder that history is not a straight line, but a branching tree of infinite possibilities. One arrow, one decision, one battle won or lost can send ripples across centuries, shaping the world in ways the participants could never have imagined. The England of Harold, the England that might have been, stands as a testament to that profound and unsettling truth. It's a world where the echoes of the Shield Wall still resound, not as a distant memory, but as a living heritage. The sun now sets on this England that never was, an England of unbroken Saxon lineage. As the shadows lengthen, You might find yourself pondering the sheer contingency of it all, the delicate threads from which our own reality is woven. The great tapestry of time could have displayed such different patterns, such vibrant alternative worlds, born from a single arrow finding a different mark, or a shield wall holding just a little longer. The weight of what might have been settles gently, a soft blanket of thought as the day ends. The stories of kings and battles fade, and the quiet hum of the present, your present, returns, perhaps a little richer for having glimpsed a world that turned on a different hinge of fate. The vast ocean of historical possibility stretches out, and we have dipped but a single toe into its waters. Rest now, and let the echoes of that other England fade into the quiet of your dreams.